Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The split brain paradox. When one person becomes two, a patient suffers from severe epilepsy, seizures that cannot be controlled by medication, seizures that spread across the brain causing disability and danger. And as a last resort, surgeons perform a procedure called corpus callosotomy, severing the corpus callosum, the massive bundle of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And this procedure prevents seizures from spreading, confines them to one hemisphere, and after surgery the patient seems normal, speaks and acts as before, personality intact, memories preserved, and casual observation reveals no deficit. But careful testing reveals something extraordinary, something deeply strange. The two hemispheres have been separated, are processing information independently, are operating as two separate cognitive systems. And in certain experimental conditions, the hemispheres appear to have different perceptions, different knowledge, different intentions, and the patient, who was one person with one unified consciousness, before surgery now seems to be two persons, two separate centers of awareness inhabiting a single body, and this is the split brain paradox, a puzzle about personal identity, about the unity of consciousness, about whether consciousness is divisible, and about what counts as a person, and the phenomenon, discovered and studied extensively by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, challenges our assumptions about the self, about the unity of the mind, and about whether consciousness is necessarily singular or could be plural within a single brain. Imagine the split brain setup. The patient sits before a screen, and images are flashed briefly to either the left or right visual field. And because of how vision is organized, the left visual field projects to the right hemisphere and the right visual field to the left hemisphere. And normally, the hemispheres communicate through the corpus callosum, sharing information. But in split brain patients, this communication is severed, and information presented to one hemisphere is not available to the other, and the left hemisphere, which controls language, can report what it sees. But the right hemisphere, which typically lacks language, cannot speak. And this creates dissociations, cases where the person can verbally report seeing something flash to the right visual field, processed by the left hemisphere, but denies seeing anything flash to the left visual field, processed by the right hemisphere, and yet the right hemisphere clearly saw the stimulus. Because when asked to point with the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, the patient points accurately, and so the patient both saw and did not see, both knows and does not know, depending on which hemisphere is asked. And the unity of consciousness seems to break down, seems to split into two separate streams. The paradox becomes even more dramatic in cases of conflicting intentions, where experimenters present different instructions to each hemisphere, and the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, performs one action while the right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, performs another, and sometimes the hands conflict. One hand buttoning a shirt while the other unbuttons it, one hand reaching for an object while the other pushes it away, and the patient reports frustration, reports feeling as if the left hand has a mind of its own, is acting independently, and the verbal left hemisphere confabulates explanations, invents reasons for the left hand's actions, reasons that are false because the left hemisphere does not know what the right hemisphere is doing, does not have access to its intentions. And these cases suggest that split brain patients are not one person, but two persons. Two separate conscious agents inhabiting one body, each with their own perceptions, their own knowledge, their own goals, and the philosophical question is whether this is correct. Whether splitting the brain splits the person, whether consciousness is divisible, whether personal identity can survive such division. Visualize consciousness before and after the surgery. Before surgery, there is one unified consciousness, one stream of awareness, experiences from both hemispheres integrated, and after surgery, this unity is broken. Each hemisphere processes information separately, and the question is whether there are now two consciousnesses, two subjects of experience, or whether there is still one consciousness that has become disconnected from some information, and different philosophers give different answers. Some argue that split brain patients become two persons, that severing the corpus callosum creates two centers of consciousness where there was one, and others argue that the patient remains one person, but with a divided consciousness, a consciousness that is no longer unified. And still others argue that consciousness remains unified, but access to information is divided, and the hemispheres are like modules within one consciousness rather than separate consciousnesses. The split brain paradox raises questions about the relationship between unity and consciousness, about whether consciousness is essentially unified or whether it could be divided or plural. And normal consciousness feels unified, feels like there is one subject experiencing everything, one perspective from which the world is viewed, and split brain cases challenge this unity, suggest that consciousness could be less unified than it seems, could be divided into separate streams that normally communicate but could operate independently. And this has implications for understanding the self, for whether the self is a unified entity or a collection of parts, for whether personal identity requires unity of consciousness or could survive division. One response to the paradox denies that split brain patients become two persons, argues that the left hemisphere, the language-dominant hemisphere, is the person, is the locus of consciousness and self-awareness, and the right hemisphere, while capable of processing information and guiding behavior, lacks the higher-order thought and self-awareness that constitute personhood. And so the patient remains one person, the left hemisphere person, and the right hemisphere is more like an unconscious module that influences behavior without being a separate conscious agent. And this response preserves the singularity of persons, but at the cost of denying consciousness to the right hemisphere. Another response accepts that split brain patients become two persons, accepts that there are two centers of consciousness after surgery, two subjects of experience, and argues that personal identity is not preserved through brain bisection, that splitting the brain creates two persons from one, and these two persons share a body, share a past, but are distinct in the present, have different experiences, different knowledge. And this response takes the split brain evidence seriously, treats the hemispheres as separate conscious systems, but faces the challenge of explaining how two persons can inhabit one body, how they coordinate, and whether one has priority over the other. A third response appeals to degrees of unity, argues that consciousness is not all or nothing unified, but comes in degrees, and split brain patients have less unified consciousness than normal people, but are not completely divided, are somewhere between one person and two, and unity of consciousness is a spectrum, and split brain patients are toward the divided end. And this response avoids the binary choice between one person and two, allows for partial division, for consciousness that is neither fully unified nor fully separate. And this seems to fit the evidence better, fits the fact that split brain patients seem mostly normal, seem like one person most of the time, but show signs of division in specific experimental conditions. The split brain paradox also connects to debates about personal identity over time, about what makes you the same person you were yesterday, about whether personal identity requires psychological continuity, and split brain cases are like thought experiments about fission made real, are actual cases where one person seems to become two, and philosophers have long debated fission cases, cases where a person's brain is divided and placed in two bodies, and asked whether the original person survives, and if so, which resulting person is the original. And split brain surgery is a partial realization of this scenario, does not create two separate bodies, but does create two separate information processing systems, and the philosophical puzzles about fission apply to split brain cases. Puzzles about identity, about survival, about what matters in personal existence. The patient lives with split brain, navigates the world, seems normal to observers, and most of the time, the two hemispheres cooperate through shared subcortical structures, through behavioral coordination, through learned patterns, and the division is not apparent. But in the laboratory, under controlled conditions, the split emerges. The two hemispheres reveal their independence, and the paradox appears: one person or two, unified or divided, single consciousness or dual, and the answer remains disputed, remains unclear, and the split brain paradox endures as one of the most fascinating and philosophically significant phenomena in neuroscience, a real-world case that challenges our understanding of consciousness, of unity, of personal identity, and of what it means to be one person rather than many. And the severed corpus callosum sits there, two hemispheres separated, and the question persists: is this one mind or two? And the paradox remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent puzzle about the nature of self and consciousness. The symbol grounding problem. Why computers never know what words really mean. A computer system is given a dictionary, a complete dictionary that defines every word in terms of other words, and the system can look up any word, follow the chains of definitions, process the relationships between symbols, and the system appears to understand language, can answer questions by manipulating symbols according to rules, can translate between languages by mapping symbols to symbols, can even generate coherent text by following patterns learned from training data. And yet philosopher Stephen Harnad asks a crucial question: does the system understand what any symbol means? Does it know what the words refer to? Or is it merely shuffling meaningless tokens according to syntactic rules? And this is the symbol grounding problem. The question of how symbols, whether in computers or in minds, acquire meaning, how they connect to the world, how they come to be about something rather than being mere formal marks. And the problem challenges purely symbolic theories of cognition, challenges the idea that thinking is symbol manipulation, and points to the need for grounding, for connecting symbols to non-symbolic experiences, to perceptions and actions, to interactions with the world that give symbols their meaning. Imagine looking up the word zebra in the dictionary, and the dictionary says a zebra is a striped equine mammal, and you look up striped and find marked with parallel bands, and you look up equine and find relating to horses, and you look up mammal and find warm-blooded vertebrate animal, and you can continue this process indefinitely, following chains of definitions, symbol to symbol to symbol. And if you have never seen a zebra, never encountered stripes or horses or animals, then all these definitions are empty, are just more words whose meanings you do not grasp, and the whole dictionary becomes a closed system of symbols referring to other symbols with no connection to reality. And this is the situation of a purely symbolic computer system. It has access to definitions, to relationships between symbols, but it has no grounding, no connection to the real zebras and stripes and horses that the symbols are supposed to be about. The symbol grounding problem challenges strong AI, the claim that implementing the right program, manipulating symbols according to the right rules, is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition. And Harnad argues that symbol manipulation alone is not enough, that understanding requires grounding, requires that at least some symbols be connected to non-symbolic experiences, to sensory inputs and motor outputs, to perceptions of the world and actions in the world. And these grounded symbols can then give meaning to other symbols through their relationships. And a hybrid system, with both grounded and symbolic components, can achieve genuine understanding, but a purely symbolic system cannot. remains forever trapped in a web of meaningless symbols, playing symbol games without comprehension. Visualize two systems. One is a person who has seen zebras, has perceived their stripes, has distinguished them from horses, and when this person uses the word zebra, it is grounded in these experiences, refers to real animals encountered in the world. And the other system is a computer that has only manipulated symbols, has processed text containing the word zebra, has learned statistical patterns, but has never perceived a zebra, never interacted with one. And when this system uses zebra, it is ungrounded, refers to nothing beyond other symbols. And Harnad's claim is that these two uses are fundamentally different, that the person understands what zebra means, and the computer does not. And the difference is grounding, is connection to non-symbolic reality. The symbol grounding problem connects to arguments in philosophy of mind, like Searle's Chinese room, which argues that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that manipulating symbols, according to rules, does not produce understanding, and both arguments challenge computational theories of mind, challenge the idea that cognition is just symbol manipulation, and both point to the need for something more, something beyond symbols. Though they disagree about what that something is, Searle appeals to intrinsic intentionality and consciousness, while Harnad appeals to sensoromotor grounding and interaction with the world. One response to the symbol grounding problem accepts it and argues that AI systems need embodiment, need sensors and actuators, need to interact with the physical world, and recent developments in robotics and embodied AI pursue this approach, creating systems that learn through perception and action, that ground their symbols in sensory experience. And these systems can associate words with visual features, can learn that zebra refers to things with certain visible properties, and this grounding, even if limited compared to human grounding, provides a foundation for meaning that purely symbolic systems lack. Another response challenges the problem, argues that grounding is not necessary for meaning, that symbol systems can have meaningful representations through their functional roles, through how symbols are used in inference and reasoning, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of symbols and their relationships. And a sufficiently complex symbolic system can have meaningful representations even without grounding in perception and action. And this response defends computationalism, defends the idea that cognition is symbol manipulation, and denies that something extra, something beyond symbols, is needed for genuine understanding. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of meaning, between dictionary meaning, which can be captured symbolically, and grounded meaning, which requires connection to experience, and argues that both kinds exist. Both are legitimate, and purely symbolic systems can have dictionary meaning even if they lack grounded meaning, and for many purposes dictionary meaning is sufficient, is all that is needed for tasks like translation or information retrieval, and so the symbol grounding problem, while real, is less threatening than it appears, shows limits on what purely symbolic systems can do, but does not show that such systems are meaningless or useless. The symbol grounding problem also has implications for language learning, for understanding how children acquire meaning, because children do not learn language from dictionaries, do not master symbols by relating them to other symbols, but learn by associating words with experiences, by hearing zebra while seeing zebras, by using words in context, by grounding language in perception and action. And this grounding happens early, provides a foundation of basic concepts, and more abstract concepts are built on this foundation through symbol-symbol relationships. And so human language combines grounding and symbolic structure, uses both perceptual and abstract meaning, and neither alone is sufficient. The computer processes text, generates responses, manipulates symbols with impressive fluency, and yet the question remains whether it understands anything, whether its symbols mean anything beyond their formal relationships, and Harnad's symbol grounding problem suggests not, suggests that without grounding in non-symbolic experience, The symbols are empty, are syntactic objects without semantic content. And the problem persists as a challenge to AI, as a question about what would be needed for machines to genuinely understand, whether symbol manipulation supplemented with machine learning is enough, or whether something else, something like embodied interaction with the world, is necessary. And the problem remains unresolved, remains debated, remains a permanent feature of discussions about AI and cognition, about meaning and understanding, about the relationship between symbols and what they represent. And the symbol grounding problem endures as a reminder that meaning is not just a matter of relationships between symbols, but requires connection to a non-symbolic ground, requires that symbols hook onto the world, requires that language touch reality. And whether computers can achieve this grounding, whether they can move beyond symbol manipulation to genuine understanding, remains one of the central questions in artificial intelligence and philosophy of mind. The Swampman Paradox. Lightning strikes a swamp, and in that instant a man walking through the marsh is vaporized, his body reduced to scattered atoms. And by an extraordinary coincidence, the same lightning strike rearranges nearby organic matter into an exact duplicate of the man, molecule for molecule, synapse for synapse, every memory and personality trait perfectly replicated by chance. And this duplicate, called Swampman by philosopher Donald Davidson, who devised the thought experiment, opens his eyes and continues walking, unaware that anything has happened, believing himself to be the man who entered the swamp moments before. The question that follows is unsettling. Is Swampman the same person as the man who was destroyed? And if not, then what is he? Does he have thoughts, beliefs, desires? Or are his internal states merely physical patterns that resemble mental states without actually being mental states? And this paradox strikes at theories of meaning, content, and personal identity, revealing tensions between physical and historical criteria for mental properties. Davidson argued that Swampman does not have thoughts or beliefs, at least not initially, because the content of mental states depends on causal history, on how those states were formed through interaction with the environment and the linguistic community. And Swampman has no history, no past interactions, no causal connections to the world. His brain states are physically identical to the original man's, but they lack the historical grounding that gives those states their meaning. And so when Swampman seems to think about his wife, he is not actually thinking about anyone, because his internal states have no reference, no connection to the people and things they superficially resemble. This position reflects a broader externalist view in philosophy of mind, the idea that mental content is not determined solely by what is inside the head, but also by external relations, by the history of how beliefs and concepts were acquired, by the environment in which the organism evolved and learned. And so two physically identical beings could have different mental contents, or one could have mental contents while the other has none, depending on their causal histories. Others find this conclusion absurd, arguing that if Swampman is physically identical to the original man, then he must have the same mental states, that consciousness and thought supervene on physical structure, that duplicating the brain duplicates the mind, and that causal history, while perhaps relevant to the origin of mental content, is not necessary for its presence at a given moment. And so Swampman thinks and believes and desires just as the original man did. And any theory that denies this is privileging abstract historical facts over concrete present reality. The Swampman paradox also raises questions about personal identity. If Swampman is not the original man, then he is a distinct person who happens to have identical memories and personality, but those memories are false. They are not his memories because he did not live through the events they seem to record. He came into existence mere seconds ago with a fabricated past, and yet, from the inside, from Swampman's perspective, everything feels continuous and real, and he has no way of discovering the truth about his origins. And this suggests that memory and subjective continuity may be insufficient for personal identity, that being the same person requires some kind of physical or causal continuity that Swampman lacks. The paradox connects to debates about functionalism in philosophy of mind, the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by what they do and how they interact with other states, rather than by their physical composition or history. And functionalism seems to imply that Swampman does have mental states because his brain plays the same functional roles as the original man's brain, and yet this conflicts with externalist intuitions about content. The Swampman thought experiment has been used to explore issues in semantics, the philosophy of language, and theories of reference, showing that our ordinary assumptions about meaning and thought are more complex and fragile than they appear, that the relationship between words and world, between inner states and outer reality, is mediated by history and causation in ways that a snapshot of physical structure cannot capture. Swampman walks through the swamp, indistinguishable from the man who died, living a life that feels real, engaging in actions that seem meaningful, and yet, according to some theories, he is hollow, a zombie of sorts, a being without genuine content, without real thoughts, a perfect imitation of a person who is not quite a person, and the paradox lingers as a question about what makes mental states meaningful, what grounds reference and belief, and whether the inside of the mind is sufficient to constitute a mind, or whether minds require roots in history, connections to the world, threads of causation that link present thoughts to past experiences in ways that brute physical similarity cannot replace. The transfer principle. Paradox when powerlessness spreads like a virus. A philosopher constructs a principle about power and control, about what things are and are not within our ability to affect. And the principle seems obviously true, seems like basic logic about how powerlessness transfers. And the principle says that if you have no power over one fact and that fact entails another fact and you have no power over the entailment itself, then you have no power over the second fact either. Powerlessness transfers across entailment, spreads from premises to conclusions, and this transfer principle is the backbone of the consequence argument for incompatibilism, is what allows the argument to move from our powerlessness over the past and laws to our powerlessness over the present. And yet, compatibilists deny this principle, argue that it is false, that powerlessness does not always transfer, that you can have power over a fact even when that fact is entailed by facts you have no power over. And this creates a paradox, because the transfer principle seems undeniable, seems like it must be true, and yet if it is true, then compatibilism is false. And if it is false, then the consequence argument fails, and both options are difficult. Both require accepting something counterintuitive, and this is the transfer principle paradox. The puzzle about whether powerlessness transfers, whether the principle is a logical truth or contains hidden errors, and the paradox sits at the heart of the free will debate, determines whether incompatibilism or compatibilism wins. And no consensus has emerged. Philosophers remain divided, and the transfer principle stands as one of the most contested principles in metaphysics. A principle that seems obvious but whose truth determines fundamental questions about freedom and determinism. Imagine the transfer principle applied to a simple case. You have no power over the fact that there was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and the Big Bang plus the laws of physics entail the current state of the universe, including your current action, and you have no power over the laws of physics, and you have no power over the entailment itself, over the fact that the Big Bang and laws entail your action. And so by the transfer principle, you have no power over your current action. Your action is not up to you, is not within your control, and if you have no power over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this reasoning seems airtight, seems like it must be correct, and yet compatibilists deny the conclusion, deny that determinism eliminates power, and so they must deny the transfer principle. must argue that power does not transfer in the way the principle claims. The transfer principle can be stated formally using symbols. If no one has power over P, and P entails Q, and no one has power over the entailment from P to Q, then no one has power over Q. And this seems like a valid rule of inference about power. Seems like it should be uncontroversial. And yet compatibilists argue it contains a subtle error, a conflation of different senses of power, or an invalid inference structure, or an equivocation on what it means to have power over something. And these objections attempt to show that the transfer principle, despite its intuitive appeal, is actually false, and powerlessness does not always transfer. Visualize powerlessness as a property that might or might not spread from one fact to another, like a contagion that sometimes transmits and sometimes does not. And the transfer principle says the contagion always spreads across entailment, always passes from premises to conclusions. But compatibilists say transmission is blocked under certain conditions, say that the link between premises and conclusions does not preserve powerlessness in the way incompatibilists claim. And this disagreement is fundamental, shapes the entire free will debate, determines which arguments succeed and which fail. One compatibilist response to the transfer principle distinguishes between two kinds of power: the power to make something the case and the power to have made something the case, and argues that the transfer principle conflates these, that while you lack the power to have made the past different, you do have the power to make the present what it is, and the presence being entailed by the past does not eliminate your power over the present, does not make your action not up to you, and the transfer principle fails because it moves illegitimately from past-directed power to present-directed power, treats them as the same when they are different. And once the distinction is recognized, the principle's apparent validity disappears. Another compatibilist response argues that the transfer principle uses the wrong notion of power, defines power in terms of ability to falsify facts, ability to make false things that are true. And this notion of power is inappropriate, is not what matters for freedom. And the right notion of power is counterfactual power. Power such that, if you had chosen differently, then different things would have happened. And counterfactual power is not governed by the transfer principle, does not transfer from premises to conclusions in the way the principle claims. And so the principle fails as a constraint on freedom, fails to show that determinism eliminates the kind of power needed for responsibility. A third compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle for some inferences but denies it for others, argues that the principle is valid in some contexts but invalid in others, and the contexts where it fails are precisely the contexts involving agency and choice, contexts where the agent is part of the causal chain between past and present, and in these contexts the agent's involvement blocks transfer, prevents powerlessness from spreading from past to present. And the transfer principle is not a universal logical truth, but a context-sensitive inference rule that admits exceptions. Incompatibilists defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist objections are sophistical, involve verbal tricks and redefinitions that obscure the real issue, and the transfer principle is valid, is a genuine constraint on power. And if you have no power over the past and laws, then you have no power over anything entailed by them. And this includes your present actions. And so determinism eliminates power, eliminates control, and compatibilism is false. And the transfer principle stands as a cornerstone of incompatibilist arguments, a principle that compatibilists cannot successfully reject without abandoning common sense about how powerlessness works. The debate over the transfer principle has generated enormous technical literature, philosophers constructing formal versions of the principle in modal logic, testing it against various cases, proposing refinements and modifications, and no consensus has emerged, and the debate reveals deep disagreements about the nature of power, about what it means to have something be up to you, about whether power is a metaphysical notion or an epistemic notion, And these disagreements shape views about free will, about whether compatibilism or incompatibilism is correct. The transfer principle also connects to debates about counterfactuals, about what would have happened if things had been different, because compatibilists often appeal to counterfactuals to explain power, say that you have power over your action because if you'd chosen differently, you would have acted differently. And incompatibilists respond that these counterfactuals do not show genuine power. Because the antecedent is impossible given determinism, you could not have chosen differently given the past and laws, and so the counterfactuals are vacuous, and compatibilist power is illusory, and the transfer principle makes this explicit, shows that compatibilist power is not real power because it is entailed by facts you have no power over. The principle stands at the centre of the free will debate, determines whether the consequence argument succeeds, whether incompatibilism is established, whether determinism is compatible with freedom, and both sides have powerful arguments. Both can make their case seem compelling, and the stalemate persists, and perhaps this reflects something deep. Perhaps the transfer principle is one of those principles where our intuitions are divided, where different ways of thinking about power lead to different judgments, and no argument can establish the principle or refute it definitively, and we are left with competing perspectives, incompatibilist and compatibilist, each coherent internally, each unsatisfying to those who adopt the other, and the transfer principle paradox endures, a principle that seems both obviously true and demonstrably false, depending on how you think about power and control. And the paradox remains unresolved, remains central to debates about free will, and powerlessness spreads or does not spread, transfers or is blocked, and which answer is correct determines whether we are free, and the transfer principle stands, controversial and crucial, a principle whose truth or falsity shapes fundamental metaphysical questions about agency and determinism. The trolley problem. Would you kill one person to save 5? A runaway trolley speeds down a track, out of control, and ahead on the track 5 people are tied up, unable to move, unaware of the approaching danger, and the trolley will kill them all unless something is done. And you stand next to a lever that controls a switch, and if you pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted onto a side track, and on that side track, 1 person is tied up, and pulling the lever will save the 5 people, but will kill the 1 person, and you have seconds to decide. And the question is asked, should you pull the lever? Should you actively cause 1 person's death to prevent 5 deaths? And this is the trolley problem, a thought experiment in ethics first formulated by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and later refined by Judith Jarvis Thomson. And the problem has generated endless debate about the nature of moral responsibility, about the difference between killing and letting die, about whether the consequences of an action are all that matter or whether the act itself has moral significance, independent of outcomes. Visualize the scenario, the track stretches ahead, the 5 people bound and helpless, the trolley barreling toward them, unstoppable, and you at the switch, hand on the lever, and time slows as you deliberate. If you do nothing, 5 people die. If you pull the lever, 1 person dies, and the arithmetic seems simple. 5 is greater than 1. Saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 is a net gain. And by this consequentialist reasoning, you should pull the lever. You should minimize harm, maximize lives saved. And many people, when presented with this scenario, say they would pull the lever, would divert the trolley, would accept responsibility for causing 1 death to prevent 5. But now consider a variation, the Fat Man variant, also called the footbridge scenario, where you stand on a bridge above the tracks, and the trolley is approaching below, heading toward the 5 people, and next to you on the bridge stands a very large person, large enough that if pushed off the bridge, they would fall onto the tracks, and their body would stop the trolley, saving the 5 people, but killing the large person. And you could push this person, could use their body as an obstruction, and the outcome is the same as before. 5 people saved, 1 person killed, And yet, when presented with this scenario, most people say they would not push, would not use the large person as a means to stop the trolley, even though the consequences are identical to the lever case. 5 saved, 1 killed. And this asymmetry, this difference in moral intuition between the two cases despite the same outcome, is what makes the trolley problem so philosophically interesting. It reveals that our moral judgments are not based purely on consequences, not purely on maximizing lives saved, but also on how those lives are saved, on whether the harm is direct or indirect, on whether someone is used as a means or merely affected as a side effect. The distinction involves the doctrine of double effect, a principle in ethics that says there is a moral difference between intending harm as a means to an end versus foreseeing harm as an unintended side effect. In the lever case, pulling the lever is intended to divert the trolley, and the death of the one person is a foreseen but unintended side effect. The one person dies because they happen to be on the diverted track, but their death is not the means by which the 5 are saved. The means is the diversion itself, whereas in the Fat Man case, pushing the person is intended precisely to use their body to stop the trolley. Their death is the means by which the 5 are saved, and this makes the act feel more like murder, more like using a person as a tool. And the doctrine of double effect says that intending harm as a means is morally worse than foreseeing harm as a side effect, even if the outcomes are identical. Critics argue that this distinction is spurious, that consequences are what matter, that if 5 lives are saved and 1 life is lost, the moral calculus is the same, regardless of how the result is achieved, and utilitarians, who judge actions by their consequences, say that both pulling the lever and pushing the large person are morally required if they maximize overall welfare, and any moral theory that forbids saving 5 lives to avoid directly causing 1 death is absurd, is giving too much weight to squeamishness or moral intuitions that evolved in contexts very different from modern ethical dilemmas. But defenders of deontological ethics, ethics based on duties and rules rather than consequences, argue that people have rights, that using someone as a means without their consent violates their dignity, that not all ways of achieving good outcomes are permissible, and that the Fat Man case is wrong precisely because it treats the large person as a mere tool, as an object to be sacrificed for the greater good. And this violates the Kantian principle that people are ends in themselves, never merely means. The trolley problem also raises questions about moral responsibility and causation, because in the lever case, you cause the death of the one person by pulling the lever, you redirect the trolley, but in the do-nothing case, you do not cause the death of the 5 people. The trolley causes their deaths, and you merely fail to prevent it. And some moral theories distinguish between killing and letting die, between acts and omissions, and say that killing is worse than letting die, that actively causing harm carries more moral weight than passively allowing harm. And by this reasoning, pulling the lever might be wrong because it involves killing, whereas doing nothing involves only letting die. But this asymmetry is controversial. Many philosophers argue that there is no deep moral difference between killing and letting die, that if you can prevent 5 deaths at the cost of 1 death, you should do so, regardless of whether the mechanism involves action or inaction. Visualize standing at the lever, frozen by indecision, the trolley approaching, the seconds ticking away, and your mind races through arguments, through principles, through gut reactions, and different moral frameworks give different answers. Consequentialism says pull, deontology says maybe not. Virtue ethics asks what a virtuous person would do, and the answer is not obvious, depends on which virtues are relevant: courage, compassion, respect for autonomy. And the problem reveals that our moral intuitions are not consistent, not unified by a single principle, but are a patchwork of different considerations, different values that sometimes conflict. And in hard cases like the trolley problem, these conflicts become explicit, become impossible to ignore, and we must choose which principle to prioritize, which value to uphold. And there is no algorithm, no formula that tells us the right answer, only judgment, only the difficult work of weighing competing considerations and making a choice we can live with. The trolley problem has been studied empirically. Psychologists have presented it to thousands of subjects, measuring their responses, looking for patterns, and the results confirm that most people distinguish between the lever and the fat man cases. Most would pull the lever, but not push the fat man. And brain imaging studies suggest that different parts of the brain are involved. The lever case activates regions associated with reasoning and calculation, while the fat man case activates regions associated with emotion and social cognition. And this suggests that our moral judgments involve both rational deliberation and emotional response, both utilitarian calculation and deontological intuition, and different scenarios trigger different systems. And the tension between these systems is what makes moral dilemmas difficult. What makes them dilemmas? Cases where no answer satisfies all our moral intuitions, where any choice involves sacrifice, involves accepting consequences or violating principles, and the trolley problem, artificial as it is, captures this structure, this irreducible difficulty that characterizes real moral life. The trolley speeds on, the people lie helpless, the lever waits, and the choice must be made, pull or don't pull, act or refrain, and the problem offers no comfort, no easy answer, only the recognition that morality is hard, that lives are at stake, that our choices matter, and that sometimes there is no right answer, only answers that feel less wrong. And the trolley problem endures, not because it resembles real dilemmas we face, but because it distills the structure of moral conflict, because it forces explicit the trade-offs we usually avoid, and because it reminds us that ethics is not a set of rules to be followed mechanically, but a practice requiring judgment, requiring courage, requiring the willingness to make difficult choices and accept responsibility for their consequences. And the trolley rolls, and the lever waits, and the question persists. The waterfall illusion, when staring at motion, makes stillness move. A person stands before a waterfall, watches the water cascade downward continuously, stares at the flowing water for several minutes, and then looks away, looks at the rocks beside the waterfall, and something strange happens. The rocks appear to move upward, appear to flow in the opposite direction from the water, even though the rocks are stationary, are not moving at all, and this upward motion is vivid, is compelling, lasts for several seconds before fading. And this is the waterfall illusion, also called the motion after effect, a phenomenon where prolonged viewing of motion in one direction causes stationary objects to appear to move in the opposite direction. And the illusion reveals something fundamental about how the visual system encodes motion. Reveals that motion perception involves opponent processes, involves neurons tuned to opposite directions that inhibit each other, and adaptation occurs. And when you stare at downward motion, the downward tuned neurons adapt, become less responsive. And when you look at stationary objects, the balance between upward and downward motion signals is disrupted. The upward neurons are relatively more active than the adapted downward neurons, and this imbalance is interpreted as upward motion. And the waterfall illusion demonstrates neural adaptation, shows that perception is not a simple recording of stimulus properties, but involves active processing that can be modified by experience, that can create illusions when adaptation disrupts normal balance. Imagine the neural mechanism. Motion perception involves direction-selective neurons, neurons that respond to motion in specific directions, and for every direction there are neurons tuned to the opposite direction, and these opponent neurons inhibit each other, creating a balanced system. And when motion occurs in one direction, the corresponding neurons respond. Signal motion, and the opponent neurons are inhibited, remain quiet, and this balance signals the direction of motion. But when you stare at motion continuously, the responding neurons adapt, fire less strongly due to prolonged activation. And when motion stops, when you look at something stationary, Both sets of neurons receive no motion signal, but the adapted neurons are less responsive than the non-adapted neurons, and this creates an imbalance. The non-adapted neurons are relatively more active, and this imbalance is interpreted as motion in their preferred direction, and the waterfall illusion occurs you see motion where there is none. The waterfall illusion is not limited to waterfalls, can be produced by any prolonged viewing of continuous motion. Staring at rotating spirals produces rotation after effects. Staring at expanding patterns produces contraction after effects. Staring at leftward motion produces rightward after effects. And the phenomenon is robust, is easy to demonstrate, can be experienced by anyone willing to stare at motion for a minute or two, and neuroscientists have studied the illusion extensively, have identified the neural mechanisms, have shown that adaptation occurs in early visual cortex, in areas like V1 and MT that process motion, and the illusion provides a window into neural processing, provides evidence for opponent mechanisms, for adaptation, for the neural basis of motion perception. Visualize the waterfall illusion as revealing that perception is relative, is based on comparisons, and motion is detected not as absolute velocity, but as a difference between signals from direction-selective neurons, and adaptation shifts the baseline, changes what counts as balanced, and after adaptation, stillness looks like motion, because the adapted system interprets stillness as imbalance. And this relativity is a feature, not a bug, is how the system efficiently encodes information, maintains sensitivity across a wide range of motion speeds by adjusting its response properties through adaptation. And the waterfall illusion is a side effect, a case where adaptation produces illusion. But the mechanism is the same mechanism that normally allows accurate motion perception in varying conditions. The waterfall illusion also has implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you perceive in the illusion is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion in terms of subjective experience. You really see the rocks moving, really experience motion, and yet no motion occurred, no physical movement in the stimulus. And this shows that conscious experiences are neural states, are patterns of brain activity that can be triggered by stimulation or by adaptation or by hallucination, and the content of experience does not uniquely determine its cause. The same experience can arise from different sources, and this supports the view that consciousness is a brain process, that experiences are states of the neural system rather than properties of external objects. And the waterfall illusion makes this vivid, shows that motion experience can exist without motion in the world. One philosophical implication concerns the reliability of perception, because if adaptation can cause illusions, can make you see motion where there is none, then how can we trust perception? How can we rely on sensory experience as a source of knowledge? And the answer is that we trust perception in context. We recognize that under normal conditions, perception is reliable, and unusual conditions like prolonged staring at motion are unusual, create temporary disruptions, and we can identify these conditions, can recognize when perception is likely to be distorted, and the waterfall illusion is understood, is explained, is known to be illusory, and this knowledge itself comes from perception, from observing that rocks do not actually move, from comparing experience to reality, and perception self-corrects, is reliable overall, even when occasionally producing illusions. The waterfall illusion also connects to theories of neural coding, to understanding how the brain represents information, and the opponent process mechanism revealed by the illusion is found throughout sensory systems. In color vision, where opponent red, green, and blue-yellow mechanisms exist. In vestibular systems that signal head rotation through opponent mechanisms. And opponent coding is an efficient way to represent bipolar dimensions, dimensions that vary between opposite extremes, and motion direction is such a dimension, varies from leftward to rightward, or upward to downward, And using opponent neurons allows the system to signal direction efficiently, and adaptation is a natural consequence of this coding scheme, is how the system maintains sensitivity and adjusts to prevailing conditions. Another implication concerns the time course of perception, because the waterfall illusion has a specific temporal profile, lasts for several seconds after adaptation, and then fades, and this fading reflects recovery from adaptation, reflects the adapted neurons returning to their baseline responsiveness. And the time course reveals the dynamics of neural adaptation, reveals how quickly neurons adapt and how quickly they recover. And studying the waterfall illusion has provided quantitative data on adaptation rates, on recovery times, on the relationship between adaptation duration and after-effect strength. And this data constrains models of visual processing, provides benchmarks that models must match. The person stands beside the waterfall, looks away at the cliff face, and the rocks rise, flow upward in apparent motion. And nothing moves, but the person's perception moves. Reflects the adapted state of motion detectors, reflects the neural imbalance created by prolonged viewing of downward flow. And the illusion fades, and the rocks become still, and adaptation recovers, and balance is restored. And the waterfall illusion remains one of the most famous demonstrations in perceptual psychology, a phenomenon that reveals neural mechanisms, that shows adaptation, that illustrates opponent processes, that demonstrates the constructed nature of motion perception. And the illusion endures, simple to produce, robust in effect, profound in implication, showing that perception is not passive reception, but is active processing, is a system that adapts, that responds to its history, that can be fooled, but that normally works accurately. And the waterfall flows, and the rocks appear to rise, and the brain reveals its mechanisms through this beautiful, compelling illusion. The voting paradox. When adding voters changes winners, impossibly. An election occurs, 3 candidates compete, and voters rank the candidates according to their preferences, and the votes are counted, and candidate A wins, receives the most support, is the clear winner. And then more voters arrive, more ballots are cast, and these new voters all rank candidate A first, all prefer A to the other candidates, all support the winner, and the votes are recounted with the additional ballots, and candidate A loses, is no longer the winner, is defeated by candidate B or C. And this seems impossible, seems to violate basic logic, seems to contradict the meaning of support. Because how can receiving additional support cause a candidate to lose? How can gaining voters result in defeat? And yet this can happen under certain voting systems, under rank choice or instant runoff systems, where voters rank candidates and losers are eliminated in rounds. And the elimination order can change when new voters are added, can cause candidates who would have been eliminated early to survive, and candidates who would have won to be eliminated. And this is the voting paradox. The demonstration that voting systems can produce inconsistent results, can violate monotonicity, can make winners lose when they gain support. And the paradox reveals that translating individual preferences into collective choices is more complex than it seems, that no voting system is perfect, that all systems have problematic properties. And the voting paradox is one of many paradoxes that arise in social choice theory, in the study of how groups make decisions, and these paradoxes show that democratic decision-making faces inherent difficulties, faces impossibilities proven by mathematical theorems. And the voting paradox remains a challenge for democratic theory, forces recognition that institutional design matters, that different voting systems produce different outcomes from the same preferences, and that choosing a voting system requires trade-offs, requires accepting some problems to avoid others. Imagine a specific example with instant runoff voting. 3 candidates A, B, C, and initially 5 voters with preferences. 2 voters prefer A, then B, then C. 2 voters prefer B, then C, then A. And 1 voter prefers C, then B, then A. And in the first round, A receives 2 first-place votes, B receives 2, C receives 1, so C is eliminated for having the fewest, and C's vote transfers to B, and B wins with 3 votes to A's 2. And now suppose 2 additional voters arrive, both ranking A first, ranking A, then C, then B, and now there are 7 voters. 4 prefer A first, and in the first round A receives 4 first place votes, B receives 2, C receives 1, so C is eliminated again, and C's vote plus the 2 new votes that ranked C second all transfer to B. Wait, let me recalculate. The 2 new voters ranked C second, so their votes would transfer to C if A were eliminated, but A has most first place votes, so instead B is eliminated for having fewest, and B's votes transfer based on second preferences. The original 2 B voters had C second, so those transfer to C, and now C has 3 votes to A's 4. And A wins, so actually this example shows A winning both times. Let me construct a different example. Consider instead 3 candidates and a scenario where initial votes create a situation where candidate B wins after C is eliminated and C's supporters transfer to B. But when new voters arrive supporting A, this changes the elimination order such that B is eliminated first and B's supporters transfer to C, and C wins, defeating A despite A gaining support. And constructing specific examples requires careful attention to transfer patterns, to how second and third preferences interact with elimination orders. And the paradox is real, has been documented, has been proven possible under instant runoff and other systems. And the mathematical possibility demonstrates that monotonicity, the principle that gaining support cannot hurt a candidate, is not guaranteed by all voting systems, is violated by some systems, and this violation is paradoxical, is counterintuitive, seems to violate the meaning of winning. The voting paradox connects to Arrow's impossibility theorem, which proves that no voting system can simultaneously satisfy a set of seemingly reasonable criteria, including monotonicity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, Pareto efficiency, and non-dictatorship, and the voting paradox is one manifestation of this impossibility, is one way that voting systems fail to satisfy all desirable properties. And Arrow's theorem shows that the paradox is not a defect of particular voting systems, but is an inherent feature of aggregating preferences. It is an unavoidable trade-off, and different voting systems make different trade-offs, prioritize different properties, and the paradox shows that monotonicity is one property that some systems sacrifice. And choosing a voting system requires deciding which properties are most important, which failures are most acceptable. Visualize the voting paradox as revealing path dependence, where the outcome depends not just on preferences but on the order in which candidates are eliminated, on the sequence of decisions, and adding voters changes. This sequence changes which candidates survive to later rounds. And this path dependence creates opportunities for paradoxes, creates situations where gaining support can hurt because it changes the path, changes who is eliminated when. And this shows that voting outcomes are not simply determined by preferences, but are mediated by procedures, by the specific rules used to aggregate preferences, and different rules produce different outcomes. One response to the voting paradox is to abandon instant runoff voting, to use systems that do not exhibit non-monotonicity and plurality voting, where the candidate with most first-place votes wins without elimination rounds, satisfies monotonicity. Gaining votes always helps under plurality, but plurality has other problems, has spoiler effects, can elect candidates opposed by majorities, and so while plurality avoids the voting paradox, it faces different paradoxes, different failures, and no system is paradox-free, and the choice is between different sets of problems. Another response is to accept that monotonicity, violations are rare, are unlikely in practice, require specific configurations of preferences, and while the voting paradox is possible, it is improbable, and instant runoff voting performs well on average. Despite theoretical problems and empirical studies of actual elections using instant runoff, find few if any cases of monotonicity violations, find that the paradox is more theoretical than practical, and this response prioritizes actual performance over theoretical properties, accepts that systems can be good enough even if not perfect. An instant runoff may be good enough despite the voting paradox. A third response develops approval voting or score voting systems where voters can express intensity of preference, can give multiple candidates approval or give candidates numerical scores. And these systems have different properties, avoid some paradoxes while potentially creating others. And approval voting satisfies monotonicity. Gaining approval always helps, but approval voting faces strategic voting problems. Voters must decide which candidates to approve. An optimal strategy depends on expectations about others' votes. And this strategic complexity is a different kind of problem, and no system eliminates all difficulties. The voting paradox also raises questions about the meaning of winning, about what it means for a candidate to have majority support, and the paradox shows that winning is system relative, is defined by the voting rules, and different rules define winning differently. And a candidate can be a winner under one system and a loser under another, even with the same preferences. And this challenges the idea that elections reveal a determinate will of the people, suggests that collective will is constructed by voting procedures rather than simply discovered, and different procedures construct different collective wills. And this has implications for democratic legitimacy, for understanding what elections achieve. And some argue that the paradox undermines electoral legitimacy, shows that election outcomes are arbitrary, are dependent on rules rather than reflecting genuine popular preferences, while others argue that the paradox shows only that rule choice matters, that democracy requires choosing rules wisely, but that elections can still be legitimate, even if different rules would produce different outcomes. The election is held, votes are counted, and candidate A wins, and more votes arrive supporting A, and votes are recounted, and A loses, and the paradox emerges, impossible but real, proven but counterintuitive, and the voting paradox stands as one of many paradoxes. In social choice theory, stands as evidence that aggregating preferences is complex, is not simply a matter of counting, but involves trade-offs, involves accepting some problems to avoid others. And the paradox shows that no voting system is perfect, that Arrow's impossibility theorem is not merely theoretical, but has practical manifestations, and the voting paradox remains relevant for democratic design, for choosing electoral systems, for understanding the limits of voting, and the paradox endures. Bradley's regress, why relations cannot connect anything. A philosopher named F.H. Bradley examines how relations work, examines how objects stand in relations to each other, how one thing is connected to another through relations like larger than, or next to, or causes, and Bradley discovers a problem, a regress that shows relations cannot do the work they are supposed to do, cannot actually connect objects. And the regress goes as follows. Suppose object A is related to object B by relation R, and now ask what connects A to R, what relates the object to the relation, and there must be another relation, call it R prime, that connects A to R, and now what connects A to R prime, there must be another relation R double prime, and the regress continues infinitely. Infinite relations needed to connect A to B through R, and the regress is vicious because each relation requires further relations to do its connecting work, and the connection never grounds, never actually occurs, and so relations do not relate, do not connect objects. And if relations cannot connect, then reality is not structured by relations, is not composed of objects standing in relations. And this is Bradley's regress, an argument against the reality of relations, an argument that shows relations are impossible, are self-defeating, and Bradley concludes that relations are unreal, are appearances rather than genuine features of reality. An ultimate reality is an undifferentiated whole, the absolute, where all apparent multiplicity and relationality dissolve into unity. Imagine two objects, a red ball and a blue ball, and the relation larger than connecting them. The red ball is larger than the blue ball, and ask how this relation connects the balls. How larger than relates the red ball to the blue ball, and there must be something that connects the red ball to the relation larger than, another relation R1, and something that connects R1 to the red ball, another relation R2. And infinite relations are needed, each requiring another relation to connect it, and the larger than relation never actually connects the balls, because the connection requires infinite intermediaries, infinite relations, and the regress shows that positing relations does not explain connection, does not explain how objects stand in relations, only pushes the question back infinitely. Bradley's regress challenges the common sense view that reality consists of objects and relations, challenges the idea that the world has relational structure, that things stand in relations to each other, and if Bradley is right, then relations are impossible, are not genuine features of reality, and the world does not have the structure we think it has, is not composed of separate objects standing in relations, but is somehow unified, is an undifferentiated whole, where separation and relation are illusions generated by thought. And this radical monism, this view that reality is one, follows from taking the regress seriously, from accepting that relations cannot relate and therefore do not exist. Visualize the regress as an infinite chain. A dash R dash B represents A related to B by R, but this structure is unstable, requires further relations R prime and R double prime to connect A to R and R to B. And these further relations require still more relations, and the chain extends infinitely in both directions. And the regress shows that relational structure is impossible, cannot ground, cannot explain how connection occurs, and Bradley uses this to argue for monism, for the view that reality is not many things related but is one thing appearing as many. One response to Bradley's regress denies that relations need relating, denies that the connection between object and relation requires a further relation, argues that relations just do relate, just do connect objects without needing intermediaries. And the regress assumes that relating requires a relation, but this assumption is false. Relations connect objects directly, intrinsically, by their nature, and no further relations are needed. And the regress does not start because the initial premise is rejected, and this response treats relating as primitive, as something relations do without explanation, without needing further entities to make them do it. Another response distinguishes between external and internal relations, argues that some relations are external, contingent, could be otherwise, and these might generate regress, but other relations are internal, necessary, grounded in the intrinsic properties of related objects, and internal relations do not require further relations to connect them because they are not separate entities but are grounded in the objects themselves. And the regress does not apply to internal relations, and while external relations might be problematic, internal relations are sufficient for much relational structure, are sufficient to ground many important connections. A third response appeals to non-relational theories, argues that what appear to be relations are really monadic properties of objects or are reducible to non-relational facts, and larger than is not a genuine relation, but is grounded in the intrinsic sizes of objects. The red ball has size S1, the blue ball has size S2, and S1 exceeds S2, and no relation is needed, no larger than exists independently. And relational facts reduce to non-relational facts about properties, and Bradley's regress is avoided by eliminating relations, replacing them with properties, and this nominalist response preserves structure without positing relations as genuine entities. Bradley's regress also appears in discussions of properties and instantiation, because instantiation is a relation between objects and properties, and the regress applies if object A instantiates property P through instantiation relation I, then what relates A to I? Another instantiation relation, I prime, and regress ensues, and various solutions have been proposed. Some deny that instantiation is a relation, argue that objects just have properties without needing an instantiation relation to connect them, and others distinguish between types of instantiation, first-order instantiation between objects and properties, and second-order instantiation between instantiation and its relata, and argue that the regress terminates at some level, is not vicious. The regress has influenced debates about the nature of facts and propositions, because facts seem to be structured by relations, seem to involve objects standing in relations, and if relations generate regress, then facts are problematic. And some philosophers have abandoned facts, have argued that reality does not contain structured facts, but only objects and properties, and true propositions do not correspond to facts, but are made true by objects having properties, and Bradley's regress motivates this austere ontology, this rejection of facts, as genuine entities. The red ball sits next to the blue ball, related by spatial proximity, or appearing to be related, and Bradley's regress asks how this relation connects them. How next to does its connecting work? And the answer involves infinite regress, infinite relations, or involves denying that relations are real. And Bradley embraces the denial, accepts monism, accepts that reality is one undifferentiated whole. And modern philosophers mostly reject Bradley's conclusion, reject monism, but the regress remains a challenge, remains a puzzle about how relations work, how connection occurs, and various solutions exist, various ways of blocking the regress, but no consensus emerges. And Bradley's regress endures as a permanent challenge to relational metaphysics, a puzzle showing that the structure of reality, the way objects stand in relations, is more problematic than common sense suggests, and the regress continues, infinite relations chaining backward, and connection remains elusive. The temporal loop paradox. Time travel narratives often stumble into a peculiar trap, one where causation forms a perfect circle with no discernible beginning, and this is the temporal loop paradox, a scenario where events cause themselves through the mechanism of time travel, creating a chain of causation that has no origin outside the loop itself. Imagine a scientist who receives a mysterious package containing detailed blueprints for a time machine, blueprints that are far beyond anything current science could produce, and the scientist follows these instructions exactly, building the machine over many years, and once it is complete they use it to travel back in time to their younger self, where they mail the very same blueprints that they received decades earlier, and so the blueprints travel from future to past in an endless cycle, created by no one, authored by no one, simply existing within the loop. The paradox is that the information has no source. It was never invented or discovered. It merely circulates through time, and the same pattern can apply to objects, people, or even entire chains of events, creating closed causal loops, where every event is both cause and effect, where nothing enters the loop from outside and nothing leaves, a self-contained system that violates the intuition that everything must have an origin, that causes must precede effects in a linear chain stretching back to some first cause. Some physicists argue that such loops are permitted by the equations of general relativity, which allow for closed time-like curves under certain exotic conditions, space-time paths that circle back on themselves so that travelling forward in time eventually brings you to your own past. And if such curves exist, then temporal loops are possible, strange but not contradictory. Others find the loops deeply troubling, a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that everything must have an explanation, that there must be a reason why the blueprints contain the information they do, but in a temporal loop, there is no reason, no explanation. The information simply is, trapped in eternal recurrence. The loop also raises questions about entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, which states that disorder always increases over time. Yet in a temporal loop, information or objects would circulate indefinitely, without decay, never accumulating errors, never losing coherence. And this seems to violate the fundamental arrow of time that thermodynamics imposes. Some theorists suggest that quantum mechanics might prevent such loops, that the probabilistic nature of quantum events would introduce small variations each time the loop repeats, causing the information to degrade over successive iterations until the loop breaks down, while others propose that consistency conditions might force the loop to be stable, that only perfectly self-consistent loops can exist, and any deviation would create contradictions that the universe does not permit. The temporal loop paradox differs from the predestination paradox in emphasis, where predestination focuses on the inevitability of events and the loss of free will. The temporal loop focuses on the absence of origins and the circular nature of causation. And both paradoxes share the unsettling feature that time travel does not change the past because the time traveler was always part of that past, their actions already woven into the fabric of history. The loop sits outside normal causation, neither created nor destroyed, neither beginning nor ending, a strange attractor in the space of possible timelines, and it forces confrontation with the question of whether the universe requires ultimate origins, whether infinite regress is possible, whether some things can simply be without explanation, and whether time is truly linear, or whether it can fold back on itself in ways that make causation circular rather than hierarchical. The temporal loop remains a staple of science fiction and a puzzle for philosophers and physicists, a scenario that feels impossible, yet may be consistent with the laws of nature, a reminder that time is stranger than common sense suggests, and that the arrow of causation we perceive, flowing from past to future, from cause to effect, may not be as fundamental as we believe, may not be the only way events can be structured, and that reality may permit loops and circles where intuition insists there should be lines. The tragedy of the commons: why shared resources destroy themselves. A village shares a common pasture, open to all herders, and each herder can graze their animals freely, can use the resource without restriction, and each herder reasons individually, calculates privately that adding one more animal to their herd brings them full benefit, brings them more milk and meat and wealth, while the cost of overgrazing is shared among all herders, is distributed across the community, and so each herder gains fully from expansion but pays only a fraction of the cost. And this asymmetry, this structure of incentives, drives each rational herder to add more animals, to maximize their individual benefit, and every herder reasons this way. Every herder expands their herd, and the commons becomes overgrazed, becomes depleted, becomes destroyed. And what was a productive shared resource becomes barren, becomes useless to everyone. And this is the tragedy of the commons, described by Garrett Hardin in 1968, a pattern where individually rational decisions lead to collective disaster, where the pursuit of self-interest in using shared resources results in the destruction of those resources. And the tragedy applies not just to grazing pastures, but to fisheries that are overfished, to aquifers that are depleted, to atmospheres that are polluted, to any shared resource where individual benefits are private but costs are collective. And the tragedy reveals a fundamental problem in resource management, shows that voluntary restraint is insufficient, shows that without collective governance, shared resources tend toward destruction, and solving the tragedy requires institutions, requires mechanisms that align individual incentives with collective sustainability. Imagine the herder's calculation more precisely. The commons can sustain a certain number of animals, and beyond that capacity, the pasture degrades, produces less grass, supports fewer animals, and when operating below capacity, each additional animal brings net benefit to its owner without significant cost to others. But when operating at or above capacity, each additional animal brings benefit to its owner while imposing costs on all herders through degradation. And the individual herder receives the full benefit, receives all the milk and meat from their additional animal, but pays only their proportional share of the degradation cost. And if there are 10 herders, then each pays 1/10 of the degradation cost. And so the individual benefit exceeds the individual cost, even when the collective cost exceeds the collective benefit. And this creates the incentive structure that drives the tragedy, that makes it individually rational to add animals even when doing so harms the collective. And every herder faces this incentive. Every herder adds animals, and the commons collapses under the weight of rational individual decisions. The tragedy of the commons demonstrates the difference between individual and collective rationality, shows that actions can be rational from an individual perspective, while being disastrous from a collective perspective. And this divergence is the core of the tragedy, is what makes the situation tragic rather than merely unfortunate. And the tragedy is not caused by irrationality or malice, but by rational pursuit of self-interest, in a context where individual and collective interests misalign. And Hardin's insight was that this misalignment is structural, is inherent in the nature of common pool resources, and cannot be solved by appeals to conscience or voluntary restraint, because any individual who restrains themselves while others do not simply sacrifices their own benefit without saving the commons. And this creates a race to the bottom, creates pressure to exploit resources before others do, and the tragedy unfolds inevitably unless institutions intervene. Visualize the tragedy as a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, where each individual faces the choice between restraint, limiting their use of the commons for collective benefit, or exploitation, maximizing their individual use at collective cost. And exploitation dominates restraint, because regardless of what others do, you are better off exploiting. If others restrain themselves, you benefit from the preserved commons, while taking more than your share. And if others exploit, then the commons is doomed anyway, and restraint only makes you worse off relative to others. And so everyone exploits. Everyone takes more than sustainable, and the commons is destroyed. And this structure shows that the tragedy is a coordination problem, is a failure to achieve collective action, and solving it requires changing the incentive structure, requires making restraint individually rational. And this can be achieved through various mechanisms, through private property that internalizes costs, through regulation that enforces limits, through community management that creates monitoring and sanctions, through taxation that makes exploitation costly. One response to the tragedy is privatization, converting commons into private property, assigning ownership to individuals who then bear the full costs and benefits of their decisions. And private owners have incentive to manage sustainably, because degradation reduces the value of their property. And this aligns individual and collective interests, makes conservation individually rational. And historical examples exist of commons being enclosed, being divided into private parcels. And while enclosure solves the tragedy, it raises questions of justice, of how property is assigned, of what happens to those who lose access. And privatization is not always feasible, is not appropriate for all resources, and some commons, like the atmosphere or the ocean, cannot be easily privatized, cannot be divided into individual holdings, and alternative solutions are needed. Another response is regulation, government intervention that imposes limits on use, that enforces sustainable practices through monitoring and penalties. And regulation can solve the tragedy by making exploitation illegal, by removing the incentive to overuse, and examples include fishing quotas, emission limits, grazing restrictions, and regulations can be effective when enforcement is strong, when violations are detected and punished. But regulation faces challenges, requires accurate information about sustainable use levels, requires political will to enforce, requires resistance to lobbying from those who benefit from exploitation, and regulations can be captured, can be weakened or undermined, and the tragedy can re-emerge if enforcement fails. A third response, emphasized by Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for this work, is community management, where local communities develop institutions to govern commons, create rules for use, establish monitoring systems, sanction violators, and these community-managed commons can be sustainable for long periods, can avoid tragedy through social norms, through reputation mechanisms, through collective decision-making, and Ostrom documented many examples worldwide of successful commons management, showed that neither privatization nor government regulation is necessary, that communities can self-organize to solve tragedies, and her work challenged Hardin's pessimism, showed that tragedy is not inevitable, that the commons can be governed sustainably when appropriate institutions exist, and the key factors include clear boundaries defining who can use the resource, rules matched to local conditions, participation in rule-making by those affected, monitoring by accountable monitors, graduated sanctions for violations, conflict resolution mechanisms, and recognition of rights to organize by external authorities. The tragedy also applies to global commons, to resources that transcend local or national boundaries. And climate change is the paradigmatic example. The atmosphere is a global commons, and each nation benefits from emitting greenhouse gases, benefits from economic activity that produces emissions, while the costs of climate change are distributed globally, are borne by all nations. And this creates the tragedy structure, makes it individually rational for each nation to emit even when collective emissions drive catastrophic change. And solving this global tragedy requires international cooperation, requires agreements that bind nations to reduce emissions, requires mechanisms for enforcement and monitoring, and achieving such cooperation is extraordinarily difficult, requires overcoming free rider problems, requires building trust among nations with divergent interests, and the failure to adequately address climate change demonstrates the difficulty of solving tragedies at global scale, shows that the larger the commons and the more diverse the users, the harder it is to achieve collective governance. The tragedy also has temporal dimensions, affects intergenerational equity, because current overuse depletes resources for future generations, and future people cannot participate in current decisions, cannot bargain or negotiate, cannot protect their interests. And this creates an asymmetry where present benefits come at future costs, and market mechanisms and democratic processes are biased toward the present, give insufficient weight to future generations. And avoiding intergenerational tragedy requires institutional commitment to sustainability, requires valuing future welfare, requires resisting the temptation to consume resources now at the expense of those not yet born, and this is perhaps the deepest tragedy, that future people cannot defend themselves against present exploitation. The commons continues to degrade, the herders continue to add animals, the pasture becomes barren, and the tragedy unfolds, driven by rational individual decisions, driven by the misalignment of individual and collective interests, and every herder suffers, loses their livelihood, destroys what sustained them, and the tragedy remains one of the most important concepts in environmental and resource economics, remains a framework for understanding why shared resources are vulnerable, why voluntary restraint is insufficient, why institutions matter, and the tragedy applies to fisheries emptied, to aquifers drained, to forests cleared, to atmospheres polluted, and avoiding tragedy requires collective action, requires governance that aligns incentives, requires institutions that make sustainability individually rational. And without such institutions, the commons tends toward destruction, and the tragedy of the commons endures as a permanent warning about the limits of individual rationality, about the need for collective governance, and about the structural challenges in managing shared resources. The surprise examination paradox. A teacher announces to a class on Friday afternoon that there will be a surprise examination sometime during the following week, and the examination will be a surprise in the sense that the students will not know on which day it will occur until the morning of the examination itself. And this announcement seems straightforward, even cruel perhaps, but harmless from a logical standpoint. Yet one clever student raises a hand and argues that the surprise examination is impossible, that it cannot occur, and the reasoning goes as follows. The examination cannot be on Friday because if it has not occurred by the end of Thursday, then the students will know it must be on Friday, and therefore it will not be a surprise, and if Friday is ruled out, then the examination cannot be on Thursday either, because if it has not occurred by the end of Wednesday, then the students will know it must be on Thursday, since Friday has been eliminated, and therefore it will not be a surprise. And this reasoning continues backward through the week, eliminating Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday in turn, until the student concludes that the surprise examination cannot occur on any day of the week, that the teacher's announcement is self-contradictory, that a surprise examination is logically impossible. The class relaxes, confident in this reasoning, and then on Wednesday morning, the teacher administers the examination, and the students are indeed surprised, and this outcome seems to vindicate the teacher and refute the student's argument. Yet the student's reasoning appeared sound. Each step seemed to follow logically from the previous one, and so a paradox emerges. The surprise examination both is and is not possible. The student's proof that it cannot occur is seemingly valid, yet the examination does occur and is genuinely surprising, and philosophers and logicians have puzzled over this paradox for decades, proposing various resolutions but reaching no consensus. One approach is to question what surprise means, to argue that the student's reasoning equivocates between different senses of surprise or knowledge, that ruling out Friday does not give the students the kind of knowledge that would make Thursday non-surprising, because the teacher could change plans, could decide not to give an examination at all, could be mistaken about the week, and so even if the students can deduce that the examination must be on Thursday if it occurs that week, they do not know with certainty that it will occur, and this residual uncertainty preserves the possibility of surprise. Another approach focuses on the self-referential nature of the announcement, arguing that the student's reasoning involves a kind of paradox of self-reference, similar to the liar paradox, because the teacher's announcement refers to the student's knowledge state, claiming that they will not know when the examination occurs, and the student's reasoning attempts to derive knowledge about the examination from the announcement itself, creating a loop where the truth of the announcement depends on whether the students believe it, and this loop generates instability, making it impossible to consistently assign truth values to the claims involved. Still another approach suggests that the student's backward induction reasoning is flawed, that while it is true that the examination cannot be on Friday, if the students know this in advance, the elimination of Friday does not straightforwardly imply that Thursday can also be eliminated, because the reasoning that rules out Thursday depends on the students believing that Friday is ruled out. But if the examination could in fact occur on Friday, despite the reasoning, then the entire chain of deductions collapses. And this highlights a problem with self-fulfilling or self-defeating prophecies, situations where believing a conclusion affects whether the conclusion is true. The surprise examination paradox also connects to issues in epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief, because the paradox involves nested levels of knowledge. The teacher knows that the students do not know when the examination will occur, the students know that the teacher knows this, and so on, and reasoning about such nested knowledge structures is notoriously tricky, prone to paradoxes and fallacies, and formal epistemic logic provides tools for analysing these structures, but also reveals their complexity and the ease with which intuitive reasoning can go astray. The paradox has applications beyond the classroom, appearing in game theory and strategic reasoning, where players must reason about what other players know and believe, and where backward induction arguments, similar to the student's reasoning, are used to solve sequential games. But these arguments can lead to counterintuitive results, situations where seemingly sound reasoning produces predictions that are violated in practice, and the surprise examination paradox serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of such reasoning. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of surprise itself, whether surprise is a psychological state, a relation between expectations and events, or a logical property of statements and situations, and whether it is coherent to announce in advance that something will be surprising, because the act of announcing seems to undermine the surprise, yet in practice, surprise examinations do occur and are surprising, and so perhaps surprise is not as fragile as the student's reasoning suggests. Perhaps it is compatible with some forms of foreknowledge, with knowing that something will happen without knowing when or how. The teacher's announcement, the student's reasoning, and the actual occurrence of the examination on Wednesday form a triangle of tension, each element seemingly incompatible with the others, yet all actually occurring, and the paradox remains unresolved, a puzzle that continues to generate papers and debates, a simple scenario that conceals deep issues about knowledge, belief, time, and the logic of self-reference. And it stands as a reminder that reasoning, even careful logical reasoning, can lead us astray when the premises involve reflexive concepts, when statements refer to their own truth or to the knowledge states of those who hear them, and that the gap between theory and practice, between what logic seems to prove and what actually happens, can reveal faults in our logical frameworks or in our understanding of concepts like knowledge and surprise, or perhaps in the very idea that logic can fully capture the complexities of situations involving human belief and expectation, and the examination comes unexpected despite the announcement, surprising despite the reasoning, and the students, shocked and unprepared, realize that the paradox is not merely abstract but painfully real, and the teacher smiles, victorious, having somehow managed to do the impossible, to give a surprise examination that was announced in advance, and yet remained a surprise, and the paradox endures, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a crack in the edifice of logical reasoning that no amount of analysis has yet managed to seal. The two-envelope paradox. A game is presented, two sealed envelopes sit before you, each containing money, and you are told that one envelope contains twice as much money as the other, but you do not know which is which, and you're allowed to choose one envelope, open it, examine the amount inside, and then decide whether to keep it or switch to the other envelope. And this simple setup leads to a paradox that has puzzled decision theorists and mathematicians for decades, because the reasoning seems to suggest you should always switch envelopes, no matter what amount you find. And yet this conclusion is absurd because switching cannot systematically improve your outcome in a symmetric situation. Suppose you open your envelope and find $100 inside, and now you reason as follows. The other envelope contains either $50 or $200, each with equal probability, and so the expected value of switching is the average of those two amounts, which is $125, more than the $100 you currently have, and therefore you should switch. But this reasoning applies no matter what amount you find in the first envelope, whether it is $10 or $1 million. And so it seems you should always switch, but this cannot be right because before opening any envelope, the two envelopes are symmetric. Neither is better than the other, and so there cannot be a strategy that consistently favors one over the other. The paradox reveals a subtle error in the reasoning. The mistake lies in the assumption that the other envelope is equally likely to contain half or double the amount in the first envelope, because this treats the two possibilities as symmetric when they are not. If the two envelope amounts were determined in advance, say $50 and $100, then finding $100 in the first envelope tells you with certainty that the other contains 50, not that it might contain 200, and the probability calculation breaks down because it fails to account for the constraints imposed by the setup. Another way to see the problem is to notice that the same reasoning would tell you to switch back after switching, creating an infinite loop of switching, which is clearly absurd. And this shows that something is wrong with the expected value calculation, though pinpointing exactly what is wrong has led to extensive debate. Some argue that the paradox arises from improper use of probability in cases where the amounts are determined but unknown, that assigning equal probability to the two possibilities is not justified without more information about how the amounts were chosen. Others point to issues with unbounded utility, suggesting that if there is no upper limit on how much money the envelopes might contain, then expected value calculations can behave strangely and lead to paradoxes. The two-envelope paradox also appears in game theory and economics, where it illustrates the danger of reasoning about probabilities without carefully specifying the underlying probability distribution, and it connects to broader puzzles about decision-making under uncertainty, such as the St. Petersburg paradox and the principle of indifference. Some versions of the paradox introduce additional twists. Suppose you open one envelope, see the amount, and are then allowed to pay a small fee to switch. Would it be rational to pay? And how much would you be willing to pay? And these variations expose tensions between different decision theories, between evidential and causal reasoning, between maximizing expected value and following dominance principles. The paradox remains a teaching tool in probability and decision theory, a cautionary tale about the risks of applying mathematical reasoning mechanically without understanding the full structure of the problem, and it reminds us that even simple games with clear rules can generate confusion when probabilities and expectations are involved. That intuition is an unreliable guide in matters of chance, and that the formalism of mathematics, while powerful, must be applied with care to avoid generating conclusions that seem compelling but are ultimately incoherent. And the two envelopes sit there, sealed and symmetrical, each containing money, and the temptation to switch, to reason that the other must be better, to calculate expected values and probabilities, leads into a trap from which logic alone struggles to escape. The twin paradox: why space travel keeps you young. Two twins stand together on Earth, both 20 years old, identical in age and appearance, and one twin boards a spaceship that accelerates to nearly the speed of light, travels to a distant star, turns around and returns to Earth, while the other twin stays home. And when the travelling twin steps off the spaceship, expecting to greet their sibling who is the same age, they discover something shocking. The twin who stayed on Earth has aged 40 years and is now 60 years old, while the travelling twin has aged only 10 years and is now 30. And this asymmetric aging is not science fiction, but a genuine prediction of Einstein's special relativity, confirmed by countless experiments with atomic clocks and particle accelerators. And yet it seems paradoxical, because relativity also says that motion is relative, that there is no absolute reference frame, that the travelling twin could equally well say they were at rest while Earth moved away and then returned, and by this reasoning the earthbound twin should be younger, and so both twins should expect the other to be younger. And this contradictory expectation is the twin paradox, a puzzle that has generated confusion and debate since Einstein first proposed special relativity in 1905. Imagine watching the travelling twins' journey from Earth. You see the spaceship accelerate to 80% of light speed, and time dilation occurs. A clock on the spaceship runs slower than clocks on Earth, ticking at 60% of the normal rate. And this is not an illusion or a trick of observation, but a genuine physical effect. Time itself passes more slowly for objects in motion, and so during the 10 years of ship time that the travelling twin experiences, 16 years pass on Earth, and when the ship turns around and returns, another 16 years pass on Earth, while only another 10 years pass on the ship. And the total is 40 years on Earth and 20 years on the ship. And the asymmetry is real. The travelling twin really has aged less. Their biological processes ran slower, their heartbeats were slower, their thoughts were slower. Everything about them unfolded in slow motion, from Earth's perspective, though from their own perspective, nothing felt different. Time seemed to pass normally, but less of it passed. Now consider the situation from the travelling twins' perspective, and here is where the paradox seems to bite. Because from the ship's viewpoint, Earth is the object in motion. Earth accelerates away, then turns around and comes back, and by the symmetry of relativity, the travelling twin might expect Earth clocks to run slower, might expect the earthbound twin to age less, and yet the prediction is the opposite, and the resolution is that the situation is not actually symmetric. The travelling twin accelerates, feels forces, experiences changes in velocity, while the earthbound twin remains in an inertial reference frame, floating freely in space, not accelerating, and this asymmetry breaks the apparent symmetry of the situation. Special relativity applies only to inertial frames moving at constant velocity, and the travelling twins' frame is not inertial. They accelerate when leaving, accelerate when turning around, and accelerate when stopping back at Earth. And these accelerations make the travelling twins' frame fundamentally different from the earthbound twins' frame. And general relativity, which handles accelerated motion, confirms that the travelling twin ages less. The accelerations cause additional time dilation effects that accumulate during the turnaround, and the overall result is that the travelling twin is younger. Visualize the journey on a space-time diagram. With time running vertically and space running horizontally, the earthbound twins' world line is a straight vertical line, moving forward in time but not in space, while the travelling twins' world line is a bent path, going up and to the right as the ship travels away, then bending at the turnaround point, then going up and to the left as the ship returns. And the key insight is that in space-time, the proper time experienced by an observer, the time measured by their own clock, is the space-time interval along their world line. And this interval is maximised for straight paths and minimised for bent paths, exactly the opposite of spatial geometry, where straight lines are the shortest distance, and so the bent world line of the travelling twin corresponds to less elapsed time. They experience fewer years because their path through space-time is longer in space but shorter in time, and this is not a matter of perspective or coordinate choice, but a geometric fact about space-time, an invariant quantity that all observers agree on. The paradox has been tested experimentally, not with human twins but with atomic clocks in the Hafele-Keating experiment. In 1971, atomic clocks were flown around the world on commercial airliners and compared with clocks that remained on the ground, and the flying clocks showed less elapsed time, exactly as relativity predicted. The effect was tiny, measured in nanoseconds, because the planes were slow compared to light speed, but it was measurable and confirmed the theory, and similar experiments have been done with clocks on satellites, with GPS systems which must account for time dilation to function accurately, with particles in accelerators whose lifetimes are extended by time dilation. And in every case, the predictions of relativity are confirmed. Moving clocks run slow, and the effect is real and cumulative. The twin paradox also raises questions about space travel and the possibility of reaching distant stars, because time dilation means that from the perspective of travellers on a fast spaceship, the journey to a star 10 light-years away need not take 10 years. If the ship travels at 99% of light speed, the travellers experience only about 1.5 years of travel time. The distance contracts in their frame. They see the universe compressed along the direction of motion, and they cross the 10 light-years in a fraction of the time it would take at lower speeds, and so interstellar travel is theoretically possible within human lifetimes, at least from the traveller's perspective. Though when they arrive home, they will find that decades or centuries have passed on Earth, their friends and family aged or dead, and this asymmetry, while not a logical contradiction, creates a deep emotional and philosophical tension. The travellers experience only a few years, but return to a world that has moved on without them. Some people respond to the twin paradox by rejecting relativity, by insisting that time is absolute, that both twins must age the same amount, that the theory must be wrong. But this response ignores the overwhelming experimental evidence, the thousands of confirmations in particle physics, astrophysics, and technology. The fact that relativity is one of the most thoroughly tested theories in all of science, and the predictions have never failed. And so the paradox is not a refutation of relativity, but a counterintuitive consequence that we must accept. And the strangeness of the result reflects the strangeness of the universe, the fact that time and space are intertwined. That time is not absolute but relative, that duration depends on motion, and that the universe operates according to rules that defy everyday intuition. The twins stand together again, one young and one old, and the younger twin has travelled through space and time, has experienced the compression of years into months, has returned to find the future arrived, and the paradox is resolved. There is no contradiction, only an asymmetry. The travelling twin accelerated, and the earthbound twin did not. And this difference explains everything, makes the situation non-symmetric, removes the paradox, and yet the strangeness remains. The fact that time is not fixed, that motion affects aging, that twins can end up different ages by taking different paths through space-time. And the twin paradox endures as a teaching tool, as an illustration of relativity's most counterintuitive predictions, as a thought experiment that has become reality through atomic clocks and particle decays, and as a reminder that the universe is stranger than common sense suggests, that time is not what we thought it was, and that the path you take through space-time determines how much time you experience, how much you age, how much life you live. And the travelling twin, younger by decades, stands as proof that Einstein was right, that time dilation is real, and that space travel, if we ever achieve the speeds required, will make astronauts into time travellers, moving forward into Earth's future while aging only slightly themselves. And the paradox, resolved but never fully domesticated, remains a monument to the weirdness of relativity and the malleability of time. The third man argument, why Plato's theory spawns infinite forms. A philosopher named Aristotle attacks his teacher, Plato's theory of forms, attacks the idea that universal properties like tallness or humanity exist as perfect eternal forms in a separate realm, and Aristotle constructs a devastating objection, an argument that shows Plato's theory generates an infinite regress, creates an endless multiplication of forms, and the argument is called the third man argument, named after an example involving men, and the argument goes as follows. Plato says that multiple tall men are tall because they participate in the form of tallness. They resemble the form. They share something with the eternal perfect tall. And now Aristotle asks, if multiple men and the form of man are all men in some sense, then what explains their similarity? What makes them all instances of manhood? And Plato's theory requires positing another form, a second form of man that the first form and the particular men all participate in. And this second form explains why the first form and the particulars are all men. But now we have the second form and the particular men and the first form, and these are all men. And what explains their similarity? And Plato's theory requires a third form, a third man, and this generates infinite regress, infinite forms, and the explanation never grounds, never stops, never reaches a final form that explains all similarity. And this is the third man argument, a reductio ad absurdum of Plato's theory of forms, showing that the theory is self-defeating, generates infinite regress, and cannot explain what it was designed to explain. Imagine the structure. Multiple particular tall men exist. Call them Tom and Tim and Ted, and they are all tall, and Plato explains this by saying they all participate in the form of tallness. Call it Form 1, and Form 1 is the perfect tall, is what makes Tom and Tim and Ted tall, and they are tall by resembling Form 1. But now notice that Tom and Tim and Ted and Form 1 are all tall, all share the property of tallness, and by Plato's own reasoning, this similarity requires explanation, requires a form that they all participate in. And so we need Form 2, a second form of tallness that explains why Form 1 and the particular men are all tall. And now we have Form 1 and Form 2 and the particular men all tall. And this similarity requires explanation, requires Form 3. And the regress continues infinitely. And tallness is not explained by a single form, but by an infinite hierarchy of forms. And this infinite hierarchy is vicious, is problematic, because each form was supposed to explain similarity, was supposed to ground the property, but the grounding never completes, requires further forms endlessly. The third man argument reveals a deep problem with Plato's theory. The problem is that forms are supposed to explain why particulars have properties, but forms themselves have properties. The form of tallness is tall, the form of beauty is beautiful. And if forms have the properties they explain, then they fall under their own domain, are subject to the same explanation they provide. And this creates regress, creates the need for higher order forms. And the regress is vicious because it undermines the explanatory role of forms, shows that forms do not actually explain anything, do not provide ultimate ground, and Aristotle uses this argument to reject Plato's separate forms, to argue that forms must exist in particulars, not in a separate realm, and that resemblance is primitive, not explained by participation in forms. Visualize the regress as a ladder. At the bottom are particular tall men. At the next rung is Form 1 that explains their tallness. At the next rung is Form 2 that explains why Form 1 and the men are all tall. At the next rung is Form 3, and the ladder extends infinitely upward, never reaching a final rung, never grounding the explanation. And climbing the ladder does not bring us closer to understanding tallness, only pushes the question higher. And the third man argument shows that Plato's theory is a ladder to nowhere, is an explanatory structure that generates infinite regress rather than providing genuine explanation. One response to the third man argument, a response Plato himself may have considered, denies that forms have the properties they explain, denies that the form of tallness is itself tall, argues that forms are paradigms, are perfect standards, but do not instantiate the properties they ground. And the form of tallness is not tall, but is what tallness is the nature of tallness. And particulars are tall by resembling the form, but the form does not resemble itself, does not participate in itself. And this blocks the regress because there is no need to explain why the form and the particulars are both tall. The form is not tall, and only particulars are tall, and the regress does not start. And this response requires distinguishing between being a property and instantiating a property, requires that forms be properties without having properties. And this is metaphysically subtle, requires careful formulation. Another response accepts that forms instantiate themselves, accepts that the form of tallness is tall, but denies that this requires further explanation, denies that the form and particulars being tall needs to be explained by a higher form, argues that the form is self-explanatory, is the ground of tallness, and the fact that the form is tall is not a further fact requiring explanation, but is constitutive of what the form is, and this response blocks the regress by denying the premise that all similarity requires explanation, allows that some similarity is primitive, is not explained by further forms, and the form of tallness being tall is primitive, grounds other tallness, but does not itself need grounding. A third response from Aristotle's own position rejects Plato's separate forms entirely, argues that universals exist in particulars not in a separate realm, and tallness exists in tall men, is immanent, not transcendent. And this avoids the third man regress because there is no separate form that is itself tall. Forms are not separate entities but are aspects of particulars, and the regress does not arise because there is no form that shares the property with particulars. And Aristotle's immanent realism avoids the third man argument by changing the metaphysical location of universals, putting them in the world rather than in a separate realm. The third man argument has influenced debates about universals throughout history, has been revived and refined, has been applied to various theories of properties, and the argument shows that any theory that posits entities to explain resemblance must be careful not to make those entities instances of what they explain, must avoid the structure that generates regress, and modern theories of properties, trope theories, and resemblance nominalism and immanent realism all have been shaped by the need to avoid the third-man regress. All have been designed to explain properties without generating infinite hierarchies. The argument also appears in discussions of sets and classes, because Russell's paradox is structurally similar, asks whether the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contains itself, and generates contradiction, and avoiding Russell's paradox requires type theory or other restrictions that prevent sets from being members of themselves, and these restrictions are analogous to the restrictions needed to avoid the third-man argument, are ways of preventing entities from falling under their own domain, and both paradoxes show that self-reference creates problems, creates regress or contradiction, and metaphysical theories must be structured to avoid self-application. Plato's forms stand in the realm of perfect ideas, tall and beautiful and just, and the particular men stand in the physical world, tall by participation in forms, and the third man appears. The need for a second form to explain why the first form and the men are similar, and then the fourth man, the fifth, infinite, regress, and Aristotle's argument stands, devastating and elegant, showing that Plato's theory contains internal incoherence, generates infinite regress, and cannot provide the explanation it promises. And the third man argument endures as one of the most famous arguments in ancient philosophy, an argument that shaped the development of metaphysics, influenced all subsequent theories of universals, and remains a permanent challenge to any theory that posits abstract entities to explain similarity. And the third man waits, hovering above the first and second, and the regress continues, and Plato's theory falters, and the argument persists.